Hello class, Professor Cook here. I am back with part 2 of Stratification, Inequality, and Poverty. And we left off just after discussing the dimensions of stratification. We talked about wealth, power, and prestige. Make sure you understand those and make sure you understand the overall levels of inequality in the US, especially what percentages of wealth and income the top 1% versus the bottom 80% control in the US. If you watch the video and looked at the pie charts here, you'll see that the top 1% controls, it's about 40% of the nation's wealth. I know this says 36, but it's about 40, rounded for slightly different measurements. So that's the statistic I'll be asking you about on the exam. Moving on, I want to talk a little bit more about how we label, define, and understand class or socioeconomic status in the United States. Socioeconomic status is a more comprehensive measure than class, but essentially we're talking about similar ideas here. So socioeconomic status, or SES, includes education, income, occupation, and it also includes things like, did your parents go to college? Did your parents own a home? Are you a native to the area? Are your parents immigrants? Things like that would all be considered in some measures of socioeconomic status. So it's a more robust and well-rounded measure. Looking at the different classes in the U.S., I like this ladder from a different textbook. I am going to walk through this and explain it. I like the graph, so you can refer to this, but I'm going to march through where I have it written out in words on the next slides. Okay. So I wanted to just, before I get there, to say about the income measures here. Those are estimates. So it's the reason we don't rely strictly on income to measure an individual or a household's class position is because you can have a lot of education and very low income, or you can have very low level of education and very high income. Also, if you are, someone who is perhaps doing illegal activities to make the income, that would put you in a high level in terms of the income, but we wouldn't necessarily consider, a drug lord to be an upper class person. Certainly their income would qualify them, but their occupation would not have the same sort of prestige and power and legitimacy that society would give to a capitalist, a CEO, company owner, inventor, something like that. Okay, so I want to start with talking about upper class and middle classes. First of all, using these terms is in no way a value judgment. It is just distinguishing what parts of the U.S. and what percentages have different amounts of that wealth, power, and prestige. So here we're going to call the capitalists the top 1% of the population. So these folks are making $1 million or more in income annually. This can include people who are heirs to fortunes and some celebrities, and also people who have businesses, etc., companies, people like Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Donald Trump, our president, and people like Oprah Winfrey, LeBron James, right? They would all, sports stars, right? I don't know, Lady Gaga, right? They would all be in this upper echelon of class. The middle class we divide into two different categories, and it's a very broad range of income and education, okay? So this is why that question about most Americans are middle class, or that's the largest quadrant of our country, is not true, because upper middle class individuals are kind of separate, and it's important to look at that differently than lower middle class households. So upper middle class households are about 15% of the country, and they're making upwards of $125,000 a year. And again, your class position and that amount of money is going to go further or less far depending on where you live. Let me come back to that in just a minute. But These individuals are living on earned incomes, so they're not necessarily living on a trust fund or on investment. They're working and earning income. This would be professional and managerial occupations, more likely white collar. So two people working, usually with at least bachelor's degrees, maybe master's or professional degrees like law degrees, medical degrees, PhDs, etc. Lower middle class households are the other half here, or the other, it's not a half, but the other category within middle class. This is 34% of our whole population, and this is around 60,000 a year in the household. And this 60,000, high 50,000s is right around median income for the entire country. So lower middle class is essentially right around the middle of our overall distribution in the US in terms of all, if I put everyone's household income together. And this will be updated soon with new information from the census. But just to finish talking about this, lower middle class individuals would include semi-professional. They definitely need two incomes to get to that level. May have some college or a bachelor's, but usually some college, maybe not a four-year degree. And I want to kind of come back to these numbers here. In the comment I made about your household income can go further or less far depending on where you live. I don't know if you saw this, but maybe a year or two ago, there was a lot of information going around social media about how much would it cost for an average household to afford a house in various parts of the country. And in order to have a home, I think in Denver, in the Denver metro area, you had to be making over $100,000 a year to afford that, right, as a household. So that might be more than one person. But that's significantly more money than you would need to own a home, say, in rural Minnesota. My friend, they just bought a home in rural Minnesota, and the house that they got was much, much less than that same house would sell for here. I'm talking hundreds of thousands of dollars less. So it's, markets are different. Okay, working class Americans are making maybe $36,000 a year or so, going to have a high school degree, maybe some certificates, some community college or two-year degrees, about 30% of the population. And then the quote-unquote lower classes, or people living in or very close to poverty, are about 20% of our entire country. Working poor is about 15%. This is a really important category to understand because the rhetoric is, something like people who are poor should just work harder. Well, a lot of people who live in poverty are working, not just full-time, but maybe more than full-time, maybe 2 or 3 jobs. So this is 15% of our overall population. They're working at least 27 weeks a year and still struggling. So that number of 19,000 a year is poverty line for a family, and for an individual it would be lower than that, but it's still a struggle. Then the underclass would be the 5% of individuals or people and households in the country who are poor, likely homeless, unemployed, really struggling to even just survive. Okay. All right, so let's do a little bit of practice to identify the social class. What you want to think about here is, what are the clues from the context about the person's level of education and what you can assume about their salary. Okay, Maria is a dental technician working in a large clinic. So Maria would likely be categorized as lower middle class because dental technicians usually do pretty well and require some post-secondary education, but are not necessarily, of the upper middle class income category. Kevin dropped out of high school, works in agriculture only in the summer, and has trouble making ends meet. So Kevin is a part, unfortunately, of that underclass, the poorest poor. The clues here are that he dropped out of high school and is struggling and he's only working in summer, so very intermittent seasonal employment. William inherited family wealth, attended private schools, and became a politician. I don't know what accent that is, other than what I assume a snotty rich person sounds like. Sorry. It's been a long day. William is a capitalist, so William is in that elite top of the ladder category. Okay. Global inequality, like I said, we're not going to have a lot of time right now to cover that, but if we look at the world overall, we do see increasing inequality. And then if we want to do country to country comparisons, we can look at the Gini index, which I will talk about in more detail than I've asked you to look up for your in-class assignment. Essentially, this is a measure between 0 and 1, quantifying the amount of inequality in a country. So the closer that number gets to 1, the more unequal or the less equal the wealth distribution is in that country. Okay? So if we had perfect equality, the Gini index would be 0. And if we had perfect inequality, the Gini index would be 1, which would be one person literally has everything. So that never happens in practice, of course, which is good. But the closer you get to the number 1, the worse the inequality is in the country. Okay, so you can kind of compare what that's like, and it's put into the context of that country. So it's on that level of the Gini index where we're comparing country to country. It's not, say, comparing between countries in a way that would skew the numbers. Hopefully that made sense. Okay, you can watch this video if you're interested. I'm not requiring that, but it is pretty interesting to consider this demographic transition idea, and that's talked about in your book. Okay, I want to talk briefly about life chances. And we are not going to do the Henrietta Lacks example. My apologies, that was something I didn't see was left in from last time. So life chances, this concept comes to us from Max Weber, and unfortunately, this whole exercise in the coronavirus and the pandemic experience is really illustrating this concept that stratification affects how you're experiencing that. Some of us, have family members who don't have the means to take care of themselves, can't take time off work, right? Have to work and or don't have health insurance. And so if they do end up in the hospital, it's going to be really, really challenging to lose income and to lose money if you're not covered by health insurance. So Max Weber, if you remember from the beginning of the semester, was interested in looking at how structure kind of affects the meaning individuals make out of a situation. Another example that might help explain this concept other than health disparities and socioeconomic status is considering the concept of a food desert, where people do not have access to fresh produce, fresh groceries, healthy foods, because they live in an area where the nearest grocery store is miles away and they cannot get to that. But they can get to a lot of fast food places and high calorie, low nutrition options. This is actually why in the United States, counterintuitively, being overweight and obese is associated with poverty. In other words, you're more likely to be overweight or obese if you are poor rather than wealthy in this country, which is not the case in most of the rest of history and the rest of the world. But this is also, life chances, unfortunately, are also why we're seeing some groups more affected by the coronavirus than others in our society. It has to do with that stratification. Okay, social mobility is moving between different class positions. As I said, in the United States, we have an open stratification system, which means you can be born in one social position and you can move up or down. So I want to kind of explain how we measure this, and I don't know if this is explained quite the same way in your text, but it's here, and I've tried to make it as easy to understand as possible. I will be asking you questions about horizontal versus vertical mobility and inter- and intra-generational mobility. Okay. I'm going to let you look over this part on your own so that I can spend a little time explaining these two concepts. Okay, if I'm looking at intragenerational mobility, the left side here, intragenerational, I am measuring what has happened to you as an individual with respect to your class position in your own lifetime. Okay? Intragenerational is looking at just you as an individual and your social mobility in your lifetime. So one example of this is, let's say someone has experienced upward intragenerational mobility, that would fit this example. If you worked at McDonald's and then you got an associate's degree and then became an LPN, we as sociologists and social scientists would consider that upward mobility, because you're going from pretty close to minimum wage to a better, hopefully better wage. You know, I know that depends, and more education required for this position. Okay, the right side here, generational mobility, is when I would compare you to your children or your parents. So if I'm comparing if you're better or worse off than your parents or your grandparents, I'm looking at intergenerational mobility. Both of these are things that we would be interested in looking at. So for example, if your parents worked minimum wage jobs, but you have a 4-year degree and work as an accountant in a middle class job, that is upward intergenerational mobility. I think all of us, would hope our children would experience some upward intergenerational mobility. Sometimes when we have in-person class, I ask people to think about if you are better off, or you expect to be better off than your grandparents, than your parents, right? And it's interesting because for some people they definitely do, and then for other Americans they don't expect to be as well off because of recent economic issues, and of course I totally lost my train of thought. Oh well, recent economic issues and the level of inequality in this country, and the fact that that's increasing. Okay, so we can look at mobility as both intergenerational and intragenerational, and we can also look at it as horizontal or vertical. Horizontal mobility is kind of that exchange where I'm just moving from one job to another job at the same level of pay and the same requirements, basically. Vertical mobility would have me moving up or down on that class position ladder. Okay, so let's do a couple of practices. And what we want to know for each of these is this intergenerational, comparing generations, or intragenerational, just looking at one person? Is this vertical or horizontal mobility? And is this up or down? So it's a lot of adjectives, almost as many as you need to order a coffee at Starbucks. Okay, let's give it a try. Cameron graduated from college, left welfare, and secured a semi-professional position. So how many people are we looking at in this question, or this statement? Just Cameron. So that means it is intragenerational. Cameron graduated from college and moved off of welfare. This is upward, and this is vertical. So this is intragenerational, upward, vertical mobility. Tom left his job in the factory to work in maintenance at the college. Again, we're only looking at Tom, so it is intragenerational, just one person within their lifetime. And for the purposes of this problem, we're just going to assume that Tom's job at the factory and working maintenance at the college require the same amount of skills and have about the same salary. And in that case, this would be horizontal mobility. Okay, intragenerational, horizontal mobility. Horizontal mobility doesn't go up or down, so we don't need to add that up or down modifier. Okay, Cecilia, you're breaking my heart. You're shaking my confidence lately, if you know Simon and Garfunkel. Anyway, Cecilia grew up with a mother who worked cleaning motels, but Cecilia is a doctor. This problem, we have Cecilia being compared with her mother. So this is intergenerational mobility, and Cecilia has moved up because she is a doctor, although her mom worked in kind of a minimum wage job. So this is intergenerational upward social mobility. Vertical, pardon me. One more example here that might help for understanding this difference. Let's consider my position as a community college faculty member. As a sociology professor, let's say that I decided to move back to Wisconsin. Not planning on that, too cold there in the winter for me. But let's say I was deciding to move back to Wisconsin and I took another position at a community college doing about the same thing for the same amount of money. This would be horizontal mobility. Okay? Horizontal mobility. But let's say instead of that, a position opened up in the college for a dean or an assistant dean or a chair or some kind of administrative position, and I moved into that role. That would be upward vertical mobility for me. Okay, so hopefully that helps with understanding those differences. I am going to stop here and we'll finish up the rest in the next section. Thanks.